Good evening, everyone. My name is Ken Hers. I'm the president of the Nebraska Cattlemen Association. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is Nebraska Cattlemen webinar series titled the Black Swan Event. During these challenging and uncertain times, we have been asked to share information. We do so through our website, through social media, through emails, through mailings. Unfortunately, sometimes we can't go into depth about some of these issues, and that's what we're going to try and do tonight with our first webinar and with all the three following. So we are trying to go into depth on issues that you are interested in to help you really understand what is going on in the markets, what is happening out there. If you enjoy this webinar, please share it with friends, neighbors. If you would like to view it again, I think it will be on Nebraska Cattlemen website. It will probably also be posted to YouTube and some other places. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have Jeff Stolle, a staff member of the Nebraska Cattlemen, give an overview of the cattle industry, cyclical and infrastructure overview. Jeff is well known for his expertise and he's well respected. I look forward to Jeff's presentation tonight and the next three events that we have. So again, thank you for joining us tonight, and please enjoy the series that we have for you. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Ken. Bonita, is the sound quality okay?
Sounds great to me.
Very good, very good. I will share my screen, slide view, and we will move ahead. Folks, on behalf of myself and the association, thank you for your time and thank you for your interest in joining tonight as we try to navigate through these very challenging, unforeseen, and unmapped challenges that we confront, not only with our own personal businesses, but as a collective industry. My task tonight is a fundamental market overview. I will do my very best to keep this strictly market focused, market fundamentals, market mechanics, and so forth. I always like to start presentations like this, especially when it's a crowd I am not necessarily familiar with, and given that I can't see any of you tonight, I would say that's definitely the case. I usually like to start with a little bit about who I'm not. I suppose the first thing I'm not is a trained ag economist. Fact is, I'm a trained animal scientist, but that was a long time ago, 28 plus years ago. And I've essentially spent those 28 years with Nebraska Cattlemen furnishing market information, gathering and furnishing market information at the Packer feedlot interface for subscribers to NC's market reporting service. So that is the angle from which I view the industry and have for quite some time. So those are the binoculars, if you will, that I tend to look through. And you will tend to see that, I think, as we move through my slide deck tonight. I will open by saying I think sometimes it's easy for us to, in these kind of times, look for singular factors that are responsible for market events. And I will tell you that I don't think there is any one singular factor other than the overriding factor of this pandemic that we can point to as the cause or the fix in this day and time. I think there are a multiplicity of factors at work here. Many of them, you have to go back at least a decade to include in the proper context, in my humble opinion. And that's where we'll start here. This slide is January 1 total cow inventories. And if you notice a big dip, a big V, if you will, with the bottom of it right there about 2014. Obviously, that was the impacts primarily of the drought years in 2011 and 2012. Over those 2 years, the cow herds in both Texas and Oklahoma, both of them within the top 5 state cow herds for numbers in the U.S., were cut into by roughly 25%. The liquidation was massive, and we saw, therefore, a liquidation in calf numbers following that led to a historic rally in prices. As we moved forward, however, and the grass green, the rains came, forage became more plentiful, we saw one of the most rapid expansion in beef cow numbers that we have seen in recent history, to the point that at this point in time, we have rebuilt total inventories back to the levels where they were before the drought took place. So we are capable at this time of producing record amounts of beef with these inventories and the technology that we have available to help us put pounds of beef into the supply chain. This chart is feeder cattle supplies outside feedlots as of January 1. And again, you can tell the numbers here recently are very, very close to what we were looking at back before the drought took hold. Not record numbers. The Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma wheat country turnout this year was not what it was a year ago. So these 2020 numbers as of January 1 outside, a little bit off from a year ago. But again, from a general sense, inventories back to the levels that we were looking at pre-drought. I always like to include this slide because I think it does a very good job of depicting what was primarily responsible for $250 5-weight steers. And essentially it was a lack of mama cows at the time and a lack of steers, or steer calves in this case. There's nothing magic about Western Kansas other than that's about as far north as one can come and have a really good consistent year-round test. But I think this slide does a good job of telling the story of how the reduction in overall inventories, how it lined up with that run to historically high prices. Yes, there were some assisting factors among them a disease that really challenged production in the pork sector. But overall, it was about a lack of numbers, and it was about a lack of protein. And it led to actions within the packing industry that are, in my humble opinion, very much contributors to some of the market actions that we have seen not only over the past month or month and a half as we've dealt with COVID, but also about 8 months ago when we dealt with the aftermath of the fire at the Tyson plant in Holcomb, Kansas. As inventories tightened and as fed cattle supplies tightened, after the drought, we saw a number of pieces of infrastructure taken offline. The largest of them being the CMS plant at Plainview, Texas. All of these that I'll bring up here are still offline today. CMS also took a plant offline at Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The Denison, Iowa plant, which was essentially the birthplace of IBP, was taken offline in August 2015. And the PM beef plant at Windham, Minnesota was also taken offline. Granted, there have been some places where there has been some increase in existing capacity, but these pieces of infrastructure went offline after the drought, have not come back online. The Plainview plant, in my mind, stands out among those four, not only because of its size, but because of the fact that shortly after the drought, in general, we saw on-feed inventories move towards the north. However, over the past year to two, we have seen that trend reverse and a movement of on-feed inventories from the north back towards the south being Texas and Kansas. So essentially, we're back to on-feed numbers that would have challenged the pre-drought years in the Texas Panhandle at this point, and still missing a major piece of packing infrastructure in that particular area. I want to compliment Dr. Elliot Dennis at UNL for helping us pull this chart together. I think this chart shows that the drought and the infrastructure coming offline as a result of the drought has proven to be a game changer, a paradigm changer, if you will. The red line is USDA's all fresh retail beef price series. The purple one, a steer and heifer composite on a dress basis, Nebraska fed cattle. I say purple, I guess maybe that's more blue. The purple being the composite beef cutout. And that's the one that's obviously in the middle. But as you can tell, coming out of the drought, the retail prices never really backtracked to any great extent from the highs. It appears that the consumer domestically and abroad has a liking for our product to the point that they were willing to keep purchasing it at levels near what the highs were. At the same time, we see a widening of the margin between that level and the comprehensive box beef. And we see a widening of the margin between the comprehensive box beef and that composite Nebraska fed cattle price. And as you notice, before the infrastructure came offline, before the drought, those three data series tended to track just about on top of each other for quite some time, all the way back to when the chart began back in January of '02. So that infrastructure coming offline, in my opinion, was a paradigm shifter, and it apparently increased leverage at a great extent at the packing sector, and it would also appear to have increased leverage at the retail sector at the counter. So I mentioned the movement of inventories here recently. This is USDA's March 1 cattle on feed data set. And just as an indicator of the shift in inventories over the last year, notice 3 to 4% increases versus year ago numbers in both Texas and Kansas, and declines of 4 to 6% in both Nebraska and Iowa. And even more telling down here, compared to the 5-year average, Texas inventories 13% above the 5-year average, Kansas +7. Nebraska and Iowa actually both 1% below par compared to the 5-year data as of the March 1 data set. Okay, so that's where the cattle are. How are we marketing the cattle at this point in time? This is USDA Livestock Mandatory Reporting's purchase type breakdown for the first quarter of this year. I got this just this morning from the folks with LMR down in St. Joe. And this is a breakdown of purchase types on a national basis, on a 5-area basis, and then for the 4 areas of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. The Colorado data set has been unavailable due to confidentiality issues for a good many months now. But as you can tell, on a 5-area basis, that 5-area geography basically being north and south through the plains in the heart of cattle feeding country, 22% of the cattle in this first quarter of 2020 marketed on a negotiated basis. Almost 70% on a formula basis, 5.8% forward contracts, and a few negotiated grids. You'll notice that the breakout from state to state, however, does vary quite a bit in and of itself, with the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region just a pinch over 7% on negotiated volume during the first quarter of 2020, a little over 19% in Kansas, 33% in Nebraska, and 50.5% in Iowa. I think when you combine the fact that from an inventory versus hooks standpoint, there are plenty cattle, plus the fact that in that 5 area, almost 80% of the cattle, better than 75 anyway, are already committed in one form or another. It produces an environment where it gets really, really difficult to sell a cash animal, especially at any time when capacity is being interrupted or there is a disruption in the ability of the packing industry to process maximum numbers. Obviously, we are at that point right now. We were at that point following the Holcomb fire. One other interesting note while we have this slide up, to this point this week, total estimated cattle slaughter is off 23% due to plant disruptions caused by labor issues and sickness due to COVID. Off 23% versus a negotiated trade of 22% on an average for the 5 area for the first quarter of this year. A little bit about basic fundamentals coming into this. Coming into the COVID pandemic, we had cattle plenty heavy. I think we will see going forward that cattle will tend to stay well above year-ago levels, partly due to these delays in being able to get cattle harvested. But coming into the year, we've seen these weights be really, really stubborn as far as showing any seasonal decline. For these charts, obviously the black line is this year. For those of you who haven't been on our website before, the red line is a year ago, 2019, and the blue line is a 3-year average at this point, 17 through 19, the 3-year average on that blue line. But just to look at previous slides, steer weights, and this slide, heifer carcass weights coming into this time frame. Before you let the big dip in beef production that's taken place over the last 2 weeks catch your eye, work back to the left of that, if you will, just a little bit, just to notice the fact that we are putting a lot of tonnage, have been putting a lot of tonnage on the market insofar as beef is concerned ever since the first of this year. A lot of weeks with 8 to 10% kind of increases in beef tonnage, beef production, essentially throwing summertime kind of tonnage levels at this market in the first quarter. This one includes all red meat, essentially adding pork production. Pork production has been up even greater percentages on a year-to-year basis comparison as compared to beef as we've worked through this first quarter. So plenty of protein around before we hit these challenges with the pandemic. So coronavirus and COVID-19 shows up and starts to proliferate itself in our country, and we are forced into some societal transitions and different behaviors that I don't know if none of us is accurate, but I've sure never seen. I would say most of us have never seen. One of those being the closing down of just about any activity that puts people together in large numbers in small places. And one of those would be restaurants in particular, schools, concert halls, hotels. All of a sudden, our population is faced with the fact that they are likely going to be spending an extended period of time at home. And as that becomes apparent, we see what I have referred to as an acute spike in retail beef demand. the demand moved to retail in the proportion that it did because food service demand, quite honestly, was being shut down. A lot of the components of food service demand were being shut down. So what results is a massive rerouting of the channels for our product to move towards retail. I've heard a number of reports of people literally buying freezers to fill up. I don't think that that is an exaggeration, but I feel like what we did is we essentially went and compressed 4 or 6 or possibly even 8 weeks worth of beef demand into 2 or 3. Talking about the food service sector in 2018, food service beef purchases were over 8 billion pounds of total production, which was a shade over 27 billion. So that's pushing 30% of our demand base, essentially 30%, moving it around and having to have it go through another route and considerable logistical challenges for our industry to get that done. This chart gives just an idea of some of the components of that food service demand. Limited service restaurants, the big blue piece there on the right, full service restaurants, the big orange piece here. But you'll just see a whole lot of pieces of this circle that at this point in time are not available as outlets for us. Bars and taverns, lodging, education. There's just a whole lot of pieces of this circle that have been taken out of play for us at this point in time. And that's the reason that we have seen some of what we have always considered premium parts of the animal, premium primals that tend to go in large volume to the food service sector. We're seeing distinct pressure on the prices of those ribs and those loins, and we're seeing upward support for prices on more of the retail focused items, the chucks, the rounds, and the grind. As the adjustment takes place for the items that have more outlets now and the items that, due to the pandemic, have had a great portion of their normal outlets taken away for the time being. This is USDA's Choice Box Beef Index. And granted, this on any given week would represent probably 15% of the total trade, but it is 0 to 21 day spot market trade. And you can see a historical rally there in that Choice Box Beef Index as the spike in retail demand took place here just a few weeks back. Now this is weekly data. So the last data point on this chart, and all of these charts are from last Friday, we've seen a bit of a bounce back in the choice index. But obviously we've taken the index to places at this point in time that easily exceed what we saw during the reaction following the fire at the Holcomb plant. This is the comprehensive cutout. Obviously, the comprehensive being a thicker test doesn't move at quite the pace that the index, that the choice index does, but generally the same type of pattern here. So what this has caused, once again, similar to what we saw following the Holcomb fire, and I hesitate a bit in making those comparisons quite so often because the The two events are probably as different as they are the same, but the market reaction following both has been very similar. We have seen a spike in margins for the packing sector again. Basis our modeling here, a spike in margins in this recent time frame that has even gone past the levels that we saw following the fire last August. And at this point in time, we have even more factors coming into play in the fact of plants being curtailed in their hours that they can run, or in some cases being closed for periods of time due to the pandemic and due to having a lot of workers falling ill. But essentially a repetition in the form of sharply higher box beef prices, sharply lower live cattle prices, and a rapid expansion of margins at that level of the industry for the second time in about an 8-month time frame. I want to spend just a bit of time here with a few thoughts on our primary risk management vehicle, that being CME's live cattle futures and options. And obviously at the yearling level, it would be feeder cattle futures and options. I'll concentrate on the live cattle contract here first, though. As we see in times of uncertainty and economic slowdowns, and in this case, a pandemic that is causing a short-term global economic slowdown, in general, a deleveraging, if you will, or a risk-off trade, not only in the commodity markets, but also in equity markets, and our commodity market not being in any way immune to that. That said, our market also not being the only one affected, namely lean hogs, crude oil are the two that come to mind that I tend to watch on a daily basis. We're seeing similar things happen in those two markets, but as you can tell, a rollback in CME live cattle open interest from levels that would have been near 400,000 contracts back in early this year to under 275,000 contracts to end last week, and a level that is even outside the 10-year range in open interest. So in general, a risk-off attitude in most all markets. And index funds, which tend to provide a large portion of the long side of the market, to whom as producers we are able to lay off risk, a sharp reduction in the net length of the index fund community, obviously since early in the year, as we have worked into this uncertainty on a global level. So we're at points here to where a component of the market that is generally always net long to some extent now is slightly net short in their position. This slide is a bit perplexing to me from the standpoint that it would have seemed that as we worked into the pandemic spreading from Asia and Europe in particular into our country and starting to take hold here, and that risk becoming obvious, that we would have likely seen an increase in risk management positions being put on to mitigate our risk insofar as our own feed inventories. This chart is put together using data from the Commitment of Traders report, and then comparing that data back essentially to cattle on feed inventories. And it's very interesting to me that this data would indicate that from about the first week of February on, we not only did not see an increase in risk management activity, but we saw a decrease in coverage as far as putting on futures or options positions in an attempt to mitigate the risk associated with the cash inventories that we're holding. And in some cases, we actually saw risk being increased instead of decreased in the form of long futures positions being added to long cash inventory positions. Now, the term producer long is not only producers as in cattle producers. This could include processors, it could include wholesalers, it could include end users. But I would submit to you that the usage of our futures contract by segments of the industry beyond the live cattle or the cattle feeding industry is fairly minimal. So there's little doubt in my mind that this data would indicate that there were some long positions being put on the break within the cattle feeding industry itself. This is our Nebraska dress steer weekly weighted average. As you can tell, as of last Friday, that weighted average was around 168, I believe, was where most of last week's trade was. Actually, John could tell you closer than I, because I've been on so many conference calls and putting presentations together that John has been taking care of most of what John and I usually do. And John, I appreciate you for that. The early test this week has been sharply lower again, although it has been on minimal volume. But as you can tell on this chart, as far as catching the industry leaning the wrong way, this was a setup where we were probably quite vulnerable to that. Generally a time where we can count on, seasonally, we can count on live cattle values moving higher to some extent through that first couple, 3 months of the year, instead of seeing a sharp break in this manner. Just a chart to indicate how the value of a Nebraska 8-weight yearling steer has been affected. And interesting to me at this point, even at prevailing levels, compared to the deferred months of the live cattle futures, there still are not any really hedgeable margins being offered in most cases versus the back months of the futures. Kind of like the futures market is sending the message that the uncertainty is great enough here that it's recommending that placements be curtailed at this point in time, and I do think that is exactly what's happening. Our NCMRS April 1 data set would indicate that in reporting feed yards placements were down roughly 25% or so versus March of last year. This would be the 5-weight steer, not quite as much of an effect on that price. Obviously, those lighter animals will get a lot farther out on the calendar and have a good many more options insofar as how to take them farther out on the calendar than a 8-weight yearling that essentially is ready to go on feed and be finished. And less options yet, probably in the form of an 8-weight heifer yearling. I think it's fair to say that marketings have also been delayed in the feeder cattle sector. And when that happens, you will tend to see a heifer yearling start to carry more flesh and probably start to be less efficient in a finishing program than the steer mate. So therefore, in some cases, we see more pressure on the prices of the bigger heifers than we do on the steer counterparts. Just taking a bit of a look forward now, just from a big picture standpoint, product is going to be there in the form of beef and pork, and in the form of total red meat production. This chart again is from Livestock Marketing Information Center out in Denver, of which NC has maintained a membership for a good many years. But this would project that we're looking at total red meat production at record levels here, both this year and next. And then when adding the chicken and turkey production, just a similar picture when you look at total meat and poultry production going forward. So without doubt, poor timing here for this kind of disruption for our industry, and a good bit of uncertainty as we move forward, trying to figure out a way to get what is a plentiful supply, not only of beef but of pork, moved through the marketing channels and on to consumers both domestically and abroad. This is my contact information, and mine and John's. John Roberts is my co-worker. And John, I'll say again, I sure appreciate you. Down at the bottom is the number for the NC office and our email addresses. If any of you are not members of the Market Reporting Service and would have an interest in our information, we would sure be happy to visit with you. So Benita, President Ken, I will wrap it up there and hopefully have time to field a few questions.
If you do have a question, we have a couple of minutes for some questions. If you want to type your question into the Q&A that's down at the bottom.
Okay, Benita, I've got one here.
Okay.
Asking what caused the second spike in packer margin late last year after the Holcomb fire, and I think in part the answer there is relatively strong demand for our product during the holiday time frame, and we did not have that plant back online until early December. So when you consider the time lag of cattle being purchased, being shipped, and product getting to the marketplace through the channels to consumers and restaurants, essentially we were still minus a key piece of infrastructure at the packing level as we generated product to fulfill that holiday demand.
If you do have any questions, please make sure you email Jeff with his email address there. I do want to tell everybody we had a little glitch tonight. We did not have as many people on as we were supposed to. So if you know somebody that was trying to get on, please let them know that we will have the recording up on our website here. Probably in the next hour, we should have that up there. So we will get that fixed for next week to allow us to have as many people on our webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Dawn Caldwell, and she has a few things to say to us tonight as we close.
Hi, everybody. This is Dawn. Hey, I will speak here in a minute, but I tell you what, there are a few questions that popped up. So Jeff, I don't know if you want to take a look at those right quick. And maybe answer, you know, there's a couple of them, the latest intel on packer slowdown and or closing, and any idea of how formula cattle are priced. If you see those popping up, I'll stop talking now and see if you want to tackle a few of those before I wrap up.
I will give it a go here, Dawn. I'll probably try to pick the ones that I feel like I might be best equipped to answer. The first one being the latest on slowdowns and or closings. I am hearing today that we will likely see Joslin, Illinois, that's a Tyson plant, likely come back online within the next few days. There is chatter that possibly Tama, the national plant at Tama, Iowa, comes back online within the next few days, or possibly, you know, early next week, I would say most likely. Same for Aurora Pack at Aurora, Illinois. To this point in time, it appears that Cargill's Fort Morgan, Colorado plant is essentially running one shift, and not sure as to how long the duration of that will last. The Greeley, the JBS Greeley, Colorado plant, excuse me, we are told will be down until the 24th, essentially through the end of next week. It appears that here within our state, the biggest challenge has been at Grand Island, but to my latest knowledge, Grand Island is still running on a double shift basis, although obviously not at full capacity. There's another question here asking about how formula cattle are priced. And I said I would pick the ones that I could answer. And I don't know that I can give a great answer for this one, other than in a myriad of different ways. I would say the one commonality in most cases is that the base price for the vast majority of formula marketing arrangements tends to be some data point that is generated by USDA's livestock mandatory reporting program. So the premiums, the discounts generally go from a base that is some type of number generated by LMR. I would say here in Nebraska, there are a lot of the formula pricing agreements that key off of the Nebraska dress weighted average. But even the word formula itself can have a myriad of different meanings depending on where you are and who you're talking to. Here's another one. The charts indicate the Packers have great margins. Why have their stock prices been dropping? I am not an equities analyst. I would imagine part of that simply has to do with the amount of news run that the challenges insofar as keeping workforces healthy and coming to work is getting in the media, and probably some reaction to the simple fact that, you know, the packing industry in general is not being able to run at full capacity to the point of generating max numbers times these expanded margins. Dawn, if you want to take over at this point, I think Benita was trying to kind of stay within an hour tonight.
Yep, I sure will. Thanks, Jeff. You did an amazing job. You gave us a ton of great information. I know for all of you that typed in questions, there is an option that Jeff can type an answer, I believe, and maybe somehow it could be included in the recording after this in the Q&A docket. I'll let Benita confirm that. Or your name is listed there. So hopefully he can get back to you on that, because there are some very, very good questions in this. I will tackle, there is one about high-end cuts stranded at restaurants, and I'll just tackle that here before I wrap up everything else. My understanding is there were high-end cuts at restaurants. Most of those were released to be utilized in different ways. So even though they weren't labeled like you would normally buy meat at the grocery store, those restaurants were allowed to find a way to retail them or donate them to shelters and that sort of thing. So that meat did not end up going to waste. If those restaurants didn't have freezer space, they were able to move that through the system for human consumption. We do have a lot of high-end meat sitting in the system at this point because demand for hamburgers seems to be very, very high. So just share that with you. And I, as Vice President of Membership of Nebraska Cattlemen, want to thank you all very, very much for joining this evening. If you are not currently a member, tonight's program and the next three coming up are an example of what Nebraska Cattlemen does for producers of every segment involved in the beef industry. We want everyone to be successful. We want to hear input from every member and know what would be most helpful to them. So all I ask is that if you are not a current member and you joined on this, consider joining and share this information with your friends and neighbors to participate in the webinars over the next 3 weeks and listen to this one after it's been posted. Thank you all so much for joining tonight. Benita, did you have any final housekeeping or wrap up for anyone?
Nope, I think you said it really good, and we are wrapped up.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Jeff.